Dublin has come 41st on a list of the world's most livable cities, according to the Economist Intelligence Unit, ahead of both London and New York. The Austrian capital, Vienna, claimed the top spot, with Melbourne in Australia placing second. Well, earlier I spoke to one of the people who compiled this list, urban data researcher Nikita Sisaudia, and I began by asking her what makes a city livable.
So we basically measure, we have 140 cities in the ranking, and we measure them across qualitative and quantitative indicators. And these qualitative or quantitative indicators belong to 5 categories. So the categories are stability, health, education, infrastructure, and the last one is cultural and environment. For some of the quantitative indicators that we have, we also use data which is sourced from reputed international sources.
I noticed that you don't have friendliness in there as one of the criteria. And obviously here in Ireland, we pride ourselves on our reputation, at least, for being friendly. Is something like that, the public's attitude to tourists or other people, is that measured anywhere?
Not exactly. We do have several cultural indicators, but they tend to mostly measure a vibrancy in the art or cultural or films or music scene. Of course, when you sort of try to rank cities across a very specific set of criteria, some of these things that make certain cities unique are lost, because it's not quite easy to measure indicators such as friendliness without a bias across cities. So we try to stick to things that we know that we can measure consistently across all locations. But of course, this is an interesting point that you raised, and we should probably consider how we can include other more qualitative indicators like this.
So Ireland does feature, Dublin is there at number 41, and Dublin is actually ahead of some of the big world cities like London, which is 48th, and New York is 57th. Some people might be surprised at big, vibrant cities like London and New York ranking quite low on the list. Why do you think they're so low?
So even though London and New York rank quite low on the list, they still have very high scores, and they still sit comfortably in the top tier of livability. And our ranking sort of suggests that all cities that are in the top tier of livability present very few challenges to living in them. However, one thing to also note about our rankings is that cities that are mid-sized or have lower population densities tend to perform better. And this is generally because these cities allow for greater cultural availability. At the same time, there is lesser pressure on infrastructure. There are relatively lower crime rates. And things like this sort of feed into the rankings, which makes sort of cities which you might not expect to be higher up in the ranking to be higher than cities like New York and London that you mentioned.
And I know that Melbourne is up near the top, as is Sydney, both in Australia. Is weather a factor or taken into account? Or can you understand why Australia is doing so well?
Yes. So Australia also has the low population density, which is also another factor with Canadian cities, like I mentioned. We do actually take climate into account. So we have an indicator that sort of measures the temperature and humidity. So we will, cities that are either have extreme heat or humidity will perform a little lower, but also cities that are very cold may perform a little lower. Australian cities tend to have better weather. Sydney tends to stay summery all around, even though it can get quite humid. And Melbourne has slightly more extreme temperatures, but still the weather is quite pleasant all year round. So yes, that's definitely a factor in the rankings.
All right. Just finally then, Nikita, Manchester used to score quite well, but after the Manchester Arena attack, it fell quite dramatically down the list. Is that fair, do you think, in terms of how you rank cities, that if they experience a one-off attack like that they would fall so far down the list?
So events that have recently happened in the recent past in a city will have a high impact on the city's score. So, for instance, if there's a terror attack in Manchester, it would tie deeply into the city's threat of terror score. But it's also important to note that if we feel that the city is stable, the scores in the next cycle are improved. So in Manchester, we have seen that this year its ranking has actually improved by 16 places, and its score has improved quite a lot as well. And we've seen that there's been a resilience and recovery from the terrorist attacks in Manchester, and that's sort of reflected in the ranking. So even if there's a slight blip over time in a city's ranking because of an isolated incident, over time the city comes back to its natural position.
And that was Nikita Sisaudia speaking to me a little earlier on. We'll take a break.